is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Radio with a Choice. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of my broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 817, August the 3rd, 1987. Before I begin the broadcast, I want to say the views expressed on this show are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAZU's staff or board of directors. Also, the following hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. And now I shall begin with World Watchers. I made a decision today that I've been thinking about for a while the Iran-Contra Gate story was unfolding, and that was that I would discontinue, I would stop World Watchers with the format that I've had for 16 and a half years, and decided that I would spend more time writing and organizing my accumulated research and getting out in a publication the material that I've already written is one composite instead of separate articles. I'm going to continue on KAZU. I like the contact and I appreciate your call-in participation, and I will share with you for 2 hours instead of 1 hour the news of the week, take the most important stories, bring up some of the material that I think is pertinent, and then share with you, and you will be part of the program, and we'll share 2 hours instead of 1, but the cassettes that go out from World Watchers by subscription to other radio stations and private subscribers around the country, I decided to discontinue or stop that. As I said, it's been 16 and a half years, and I want to move on and do some other things. And I realized that after the Iran-Contra affair with the parade of characters of 30 witnesses that came across the screen, that it was time to study the relationship of them to each other and to the past events I've spoken about, and chart and diagram the historical context in which I place these people. There will be a lot of books coming out, some more congressional hearings and so forth. So starting October the 5th, I will do the formal part of World Watchers through August and September. Then starting October the 5th, we will go to 2 hours a week for this community, and I will not make those available in other cities or to other people. I'm just too inundated with mail and telephone calls and requests for tapes or sheets or broadcasts from around the country and from Canada that I just don't have time to even answer the mail or think about it. And therefore, I believe it's time to just slow down a little bit, and we'll do the talk show and leave the other part to history. And the past broadcasts are available. They're numbered and dated if people want that material. For those of you who followed the news last week, there was Chief of Staff Donald Reagan in the hot seat with no hot questions, oozing out his charm. He was so disliked when he was in the White House in Washington, and there was the Mr. Lovable Donald Reagan just smiling and very happy to be there. And in the course of questioning him about the White House, Senator Paul Sarbanes, a Democrat of Maryland, made a very startling conclusion. It was dramatic. He said there was a junta in the White House and the National Security Council that was commandeered by the Foreign Policy Initiative. They took it over and relegated the highest officials in the country to ignorance, if you believe they were in ignorance. He said you had Poindexter and North and their associates, in effect invoking the authority of the President of the United States, freezing out the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and pursuing their own policies which the President of the United States said if I had known, I would have strongly opposed. And it was a very dramatic moment where they talked about a vice admiral and a lieutenant colonel who decided they were the sole repository of wisdom, truth, and patriotism, according to Chairman Daniel Inouye. And they they kept the information from the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Joint Chief of Staff, and the Congress. And Senator Inouye joined Senator Sarbanes by saying, you had a mini junta there. And this was a shock to hear the word junta in the White House, even a mini junta. But remember that all of these people are lying through their teeth. Nothing like this happened without their knowing it, and there were a handful of people that knew about it. There was participation of the Defense Department, the State Department, the CIA, the National Security Council. They were all in it, and the Contras and the worldwide network of banking connections in the Panama, Cayman Islands, and Florida, out of Switzerland, and so forth. There was a quotation in People's Daily World about the secret junta inside the White House, and with great glee that this horrible thing had been exposed, they thought that this was a miracle to talk about the chief of state and his fellow cohorts being frozen out. But that isn't the way it happened. The Washington Post this morning and San Francisco Chronicle had a story about Donald Reagan, the same character who let them know about this terrible junta, and he said that at first his plan was to blame the National Security Council. Now remember the William Casey, Oliver North Poindexter script. Casey said to North, "You can be the fall guy." North says, "I'll take the spear, I'll be the fall guy." And then Casey says, "But you're not high enough. It'll be Poindexter." "Oh yeah, that's Poindexter and North, sure." And several, about 6 or 10 cohorts that have been murdered or passed away untimely, or as they said at the hearings, conveniently, in the last few months. But the Washington Post had a story about Donald Reagan, and he said the night before the announcement of that diversion memo that was located by the Justice Department, he thought that they should plan to blame just the National Security Council as a chief of staff. And he said Reagan's plan of action that he drew up November the 24th envisioned laying the blame on the national security. Well, that's what William Casey was saying. That's what Oliver North testified about. And then he said he would say that Poindexter was part of this scheme of covering up, and that he was involved with the activities that brought the president to this point of embarrassment. But then Don Reagan went on to say, "I was very confused. I was going to use this as our cover line, but the president's comments about the meeting with the congressional leaders and on the air, television, and so forth, said he was sympathetic towards North and Poindexter, and those were the two people that Don Reagan wanted to put the blame on for everything that happened." To hear the speeches this morning at the finale of the hearings, it again narrowed down to these two, and Don Reagan couldn't figure out why the president defended the NSC because it was supposed to be the fall guy. Well, that's not inconsistent. Blame Oliver North and John Poindexter. They have pretty broad shoulders, and they'll be millionaires, while the other guy said, "I don't know anything," and they won't be rich at all. The fall guys are the ones who make the millions of dollars, and so that they're willing to take that chance, and there'll be movies and books and you know what, and neither of them have been fired from what they're doing. They've got jobs that continue at the same level. So Don Reagan said when he was going to announce the NSC did it, there was confusion because the president was praising them. And on November the 25th, when the diversion memo appeared, the president and the vice president called Oliver North at the hotel and told him he was a hero. So he was a hero for burning all the material, destroying the documents, as was Poindexter. And so they were doing what they were supposed to do. He was congratulating them. And Don Reagan said, "Well, the president is praising them. It's hard to make him the fall guy." But they did both because there's a lot of contradictions. And it didn't bother the administration to let them be the fall guy and then praise them for what they did. The Wall Street Journal had an article today, "Iran hearings show conflict on policies the Reagan inspired the top advisors to follow." And it goes on to say that Ronald Reagan isn't just a script reader. They're just catching on. He's a script writer. And when the Iran-Contra affair unraveled last fall, he was victimized by misinformation. He appeared to have demonstrated very little anger or sense of betrayal for those who plunged his administration to chaos by diverting the Iran arms sales profits to the Nicaraguan insurgents. Well, why should he be concerned? He didn't show anger. He doesn't show any hostility towards North and Poindexter. That's because he knew what they knew and probably wrote the script for what they were doing and the suggestions for what they were doing. So he smiles and gives accolades to them while Senator Inouye and the others act so serious as if this country was literally stolen or given away to those guys. When those guys feel comfortable with their boss, and the contradictions will be just put out like Alice in Wonderland's story, and history can read both sides from the same people. Caspar Weinberger testified this morning, and of course he said he was very upset because he and George Shultz were given disinformation by the CIA, and that disinformation or information was selectively used to advance the position of the policy issues with the President of the United States. That William Casey told the President of the United States that Iran was falling apart, Iraq was winning the war, Iran needed weapons, and Weinberger thought that was terrible to give disinformation to the President of the United States. But you remember March 1983 when he stood up in the Defense Department and had a press conference with a pointer showing a map with an airstrip to Grenada. This is where the great Russian airplanes were going to land. They were going to invade the north part of America and the west part of America, the east and west sides, and use those air bases in Grenada, the large base, for a landing strip to take over our country in Central America. And after they invaded Grenada, it turned out that a British company was building the airstrip. It's not big for Russian weapons. It was to hope to get a resort going there or vacation land in Grenada, and he was giving disinformation to us the entire length of the Reagan administration so far, filled with lies and statistics. And then he gets up on television under oath and says, can you imagine giving William Casey the wrong information? The San Francisco Chronicle had a large article this week, and you'll see many of them, with the following line, the big cover story: the Colonel's coup. The Iran-Contra affair was run from the start to finish by career military personnel. The colonels did it. And then they have pictures along with this big headline. And there's General Richard Secord, a general. There's Admiral John Poindexter. There's General Robert Dutton. There's General John Singlaub. The colonels were Robert McFarland and Oliver North, but there were 3 generals and 1 admiral, and they were very high up. And this story that the colonel down below did it all simply isn't true. Now, to conclude their hearings, they quickly said there were 250,000 documents, 30 witnesses, 41 days of testimony. The investigations of this kind of behavior, this malfeasance in the White House or in Washington, is always covered up with statistics. And then Daniel Inouye reminded us the Watergate had 53 days of public testimony, 134 days of hearings, and 81 witnesses. And it reminds me of the Warren Commission, where J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had 25,000 interviews, 2,300 reports, 25,400 pages. The Secret Service had 5,550 interviews, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of these groupings makes the decision before the commission or the inquiry begins what the conclusion is. Then they take the evidence and the questions and the witnesses to fit the agreed-upon conclusion before they ever get started. With the Warren Commission, it was Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, and Jack Ruby had 1-minute epilepsy. With Watergate, it was Richard Nixon was, according to those tapes, and there was so much else about him, he was making payoffs or planning to pay off witnesses, and his anxious, eager beavers from the White House basement, again, were tampering with Democratic headquarters, but the real crime was the payoff of witnesses. And in the case of the Iran-Contra affair, they narrowed the entire affair down to how did the decision come to sell weapons to Iran when this is a terrorist country, and why was the decision made to divert profits down to Central America? And none of their answers or the responses or questions even came near the truth. There were 3 factors that caused these hearings. They didn't want to have them. I've had, among my articles and collections, material on all of these issues, not the diversion of the profit of the arms sales, but arming Iran, this administration, since late 1980, and even prior to that. But the breaking the Boland Amendment, the military and CIA assisting in Central America, this was all common knowledge. And there are only 3 factors, again, that caused the hearings in the first place, or all these sanctimonious members of the House and Senate wouldn't even be opening their mouths. One was the newspaper in Lebanon that broke the story of arms to Iran. One was the blackmail threat of Roy Furmark and Adnan Khashoggi, who said that they loaned $10 million to the White House team to get the arms going for Iran. And instead of getting their money, it was the money went down and was diverted to arming the Contras. And then Mr. Hassenfuss landed in the grass, and his Southern Air plane was linked to the same company, the same plane that was shipping arms to Iran. Other than that, they could have sailed through the entire Reagan administration and kept doing more, including their 50 current covert operations that are still going on. Senator Cohn of Maine was interviewed after the hearings today. Some of you might have seen him on television. And they said to him, how are you ever going to dissolve the discrepancies? Well, they could do that in 10 minutes if they got the right people under oath. But he settled for what they settled for, and these commissions settled for. He said, we will never be able to dissolve the discrepancies. He said, this Senate-House report will be a preliminary report. History will produce more. And that is true, and Senator Cohn is right. When the report comes out, it will be a preliminary, like the Senate Watergate hearings or the Warren report. And this report, they're all of the same fabric and same people behind these machinations. But there are processes that can bring out the truth if you have the patience and live long enough. There is an orderly process to bring these things about. First are the public hearings, which we have seen. I watched them from gavel to gavel and even got up at 6 every morning, which almost killed me. I'm so glad it's over. The public hearings, and then they publish their book, and they give you little tidbits like the Tower Report, which is filled with information. Then there's a prosecution of a few, and they begin giving immunity to the lesser ones like they did at Watergate. And if they prosecuted the lesser ones, they'd be less likely to destroy and shred papers and lie. But they let all of them off, trying to get what they call the top dogs, and then the top dogs are forgiven, just like Richard Nixon wasn't impeached. He goes home and comes back as the elder statesman, and they're giving immunity right now to just about everybody except Oliver North and John Poindexter and Richard Secor and Albert Hakim, and then they'll get the other two. Poindexter and North will get a pardon from the president. The third process is congressional committees. At the time of Watergate, there was Senator Frank Church and Representative Pike. With the Kennedy assassination, the House Select Committee on Assassination started going into the murder of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy again in 1976, came to a conclusion there was a conspiracy in both cases. And in this case, the judiciary and various members of Congress are delving into some hard questions, and they pertain to all of the subjects that should have been heard publicly, but they go into small committees, and you don't get word-to-word, day-to-day vision of what's asked or not asked, and then you can buy the hearings if you know where to order them from the government printing office. Then the fourth stage is individual researchers or muckrackers, such as myself or others who expose publicly the real or apparent misconduct, and the books that will come out, articles that have come out, more articles, newsletters, and these individuals are the ones that fill the libraries, the bookstores, and make the extensive connections and details that have to be made. The congressional committees are just a group of idiots that sit there, but they do open a door, and as John Ehrlichman said at the time of Watergate, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Then the fifth recourse is if there are private lawsuits. In this case, there's the Christic Institute that has named 28 defendants that are very much a part of the Iran-Contra affair. It was a shame that people in Washington didn't even acknowledge their existence and made slurring remarks about them, and hope that they never have to see or hear from the likes of Danny Sheehan, who's probably 2 miles away from where the Watergate hearings were taking place, but they ignore him as if he's just a non-person. But there is a progress that will be going on for years, probably for all of our lifetimes, because this isn't going to stop for a long, long time. So while those pasty-faced men up there, all men, there wasn't a woman among them, give their little excuses and cover-ups, there will be more that will come out in spite of the dumb faces they had, the dumb questions they had, the evasions they took, the speeches they allowed, and so forth. But the system always stays the same. It's made to stay the same. it will stay intact. There will be no congressional approval of the National Security Director. The military admirals and generals will fill the NSC staff and take control of the president's ears. It's the year of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. You'll hear quotes, how great the system works, its strength, the necessity for the president and Congress to work together on foreign policy, domestic policy. But they don't tell you, and this is essential, and we've shared this many times, when the Constitution was written, there was no National Security Council. There was no CIA. And once that was put together with William Stevenson of British intelligence, who moved to Rockefeller Center in 1943 and combined the know-how of the great British Empire with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence of the Eastern Division. Once the war was over in 1945, and Stevenson and Gehlen and Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles and William Sullivan, William Donovan and William Casey all got together, then the National Security Council toppled the decision-making of foreign policy, and the Constitution goes to hell. And if you don't get rid of the NSC, there's no balance with the Constitution. They keep saying in the hearings, if you watch them day after day, how can the president, the executive, get away with the legislative? We have to find peace. Well, the legislative are 500-something elected boobs who don't have the nerve and guts to say to the president, the people feeding your ears are lying to you like Casey lied to you. They want a war. They're trained for war. They went to the war college. They live and die for this great big bang. So the Congress are pushed aside. And what they call coexistence is that the Congress gives the NSC advisors, such as Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Frank Carlucci, the likes of them, everything they want. A listener called last week on the talk show part of the program and reminded me of the colonel, or the description of the colonel in the White House, in the book by Peter Drucker called Adventure of a Bystander. And I got it out, and what I read in there this week, I've read it before, is pertinent to these hearings and to the conflict, the constitutional conflict that's taking place. Peter Drucker brought Fritz Kramer to this country. They both grew up in Frankfurt, Germany. Kramer, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, Kramer, the plans officer of the Pentagon, Kramer, who sits in the National Security Council, the mentor to Alexander Haig, who would like to be president of the United States. Fritz Kramer, according to Peter Drucker, who brought him here, had three goals, and they lived and worked through the person named Henry Kissinger. The first thing he said about government is the primacy of foreign policy over domestic policies. Foreign policy deals with survival in this very dangerous world. Only, he says, after you survive can a country concern itself with the Constitution, with the laws, with social justice, and with economics. Now, Fritz Kramer, sitting in the National Security Council, can certainly tell Oliver North that the Constitution and laws have to wait. That's why Secretary Fawn Hall says she's a team worker. You have to be above the law because you have to survive the menace of the Soviet beast. And the Constitution, laws, and social justice, or economics, such as going to debt or spending $1 trillion a year or 10 trillion, or how many is it for Star Wars and the crazy figures that came out. So this is primary. This is what Kramer believes and what he told Kissinger. The second point about Fritz Kramer, he said, is the primacy of power in foreign affairs. Power, he meant, is military strength and military might. Now, the protégés of Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger in the NSC, such as John Lehman, our Secretary of Navy, who wanted these 600 huge ships while the country goes bankrupt, Robert McFarland, Fawn Hall's mother worked for her, McFarland, setting up a lot of the duplicity right under and with the cooperation of the President of the United States and with North, and later he was under McFarland, he took his job, and Caspar Weinberger and Admiral Poindexter have power and military might. And the third requirement was a great man as a foreign minister, and he set up Henry Kissinger, who went from, they put him into Harvard, and then the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Bilderberger, and the Trilateral Commission, and after Kissinger was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, he's the roving ambassador for a fee of $10,000 or $20,000 a day of Kissinger Associates, and he conducts foreign policy as which is, as Fritz Kramer said, the conduct of foreign policy affairs was the ultimate challenge to statesmanship. It required a genius. And all of these people that got up to speak, George Shultz and Weinberger and many others, referred to the genius of Henry Kissinger. And he controls the news media. Every one of the 4 major stations has access. And, of course, when this Iran-Contra affair began and ended, you saw Brent Scowcroft on the TV. He's chairman of Kissinger Associates. You see Alexander Haig. You see Henry Kissinger, the elder statesmen that sit back. And if these guys got caught from the newspaper in Lebanon and so forth, then they have Kissinger and Haig and Kramer sitting back there. They have their own safety net. Now, we heard a lot about the rule of law. George Shultz told it's the coin, the crown, or whatever it was so sickening to hear his quotation. The rule of law. This was so important. Congress has to be informed. But what were these people mad about? What was their nose out of joint for? It was out of joint because they had to have a committee in spite of all the evidence that came down, in spite of Reagan's incompetence. They know his duplicity, and they covered this up very well. They had to have hearings. They were complaining, what? Because Congress wasn't consulted, because they bypassed the State Department, the Joint Chief of Staff. I don't believe they did all that, but that's what they want to think happened. The Secretary of Defense, the CIA, and National Security Agency, they were out on their own, and Congress wasn't consulted. Congress was lied to. There are 8 members of Congress from the House, the Senate Intelligence, the House Intelligence, who are always told about covert actions. And if this is true, they've been informed and already had written findings on 50 covert actions that Reagan has been manipulating. Just at the time the Iran-Contra affair came down, they said there were 50 that he was in operation doing now. But they wanted to be included. And they gave an example that it's exceptional that they weren't included in the arms sales to Iran. But they're reminded by Caspar Weinberger, we got along very well with the Grenada invasion, because we told Congress about it, and the House Intelligence, Senate Intelligence knew on Friday the invasion was Sunday, and you didn't say a word, and you didn't leak, and we could be great friends. Well, what was so great about the Grenada invasion? What if the 8 members or 6 members had said, wait, why are you going in there? Why do you have to kill Maurice Bishop? Is there any alternative to what you've cooked up? This was Admiral Poindexter and Robert Brown of Soldier of Fortune, and Ollie North and Robert McFarlane. They cooked up and they cooked up this Grenada invasion. Would the members of Congress, the group that's informed, have input about objecting? Did they say prove that the airstrip was built by the Soviet Union? What makes Maurice Bishop seek Soviet assistance? In March of 1983, he was in the White House trying to see and spoke with William Clark for a few moments, and he left so dejected he had to depend on the Soviet Union for keeping their small island going. And what did we gain? And the various persons that got up, 2 or 3 witnesses mentioned the great successes like Grenada. And they're proud of Grenada. The people that want to be notified, that want the rule of law, that want to be consulted, want to be kept informed on who they're going to kill, who they're going to overthrow, whether it's Mozambique or Laos or Angola. They want to participate. They don't want to be outsiders. And they feel this makes them strong. And the invasion of Grenada made America strong. Reagan never stood so tall, they said. And why did he stand tall? Because he could prove to Ollie North and his Vietnam survivors, we will win the next one, and they go in on this little island and take it. So the Senate and House Intelligence want findings. That's what we heard over and over again. They want to be in. They want to make it legal. You put it down like the Hughes Ryan bill that said put in writing where you're going to go so we know where you're going to go. And we haven't heard one episode that they stopped. They liked the adventures in Iran when Mossadegh was killed, in Guatemala with Arbenz, in Nicaragua, in Taiwan with a dictatorship of 40 years that just said this past week they're going to give up their 40-year dictatorship, with the coup in South Korea, with the murder of Allende in Chile, with Bhutto in Pakistan, with the shooting of Mrs. Indira Gandhi in India, with the Dallas episode, November 22nd, 1963. None of them challenged the horrible lies or questioned the 250 books since the assassination that disproved the entire Warren Report. These people want to know when we overthrow Laos. John Singlaub's over there now. When we overthrow Bolivia again and put in the cocaine barons. Frank Carlucci helped overthrow Brazil for a 24-year dictatorship. We killed Mr. Trujillo, Dominican Republic. We want to get rid of Noriega. In Panama, overthrow Angola, Afghanistan. Keep trying to kill Castro in Cuba. We helped kill in Philippines, put the coup in there. And Mr. Aquino was shot down with the assistance of persons close to our intelligence community. And I'll continue in 1 minute. We'll take a 1-minute break here and just finish off what these people want to be included in. They feel that they were bypassed because the National Security Council didn't call and tell them about these wonderful things. I'll take a 1-minute break right now and tell you that when this next half hour is over, World Watchers, in case you're new listeners and don't know about the format here, or for those who do know, we switch to 1-hour talk show, and you call and contribute your feelings. I'd like to know what you feel about the Iran-Contra affair, what you've heard with this parade of 30 witnesses and all these days that they've been in front of us. Who were your favorites? Who were the worst? How do you feel about it? And we'll do that in about 30 minutes. And I'll continue with the second half now of World Watchers program number 817. So the gist of these people, getting back to what they were complaining about, and once the transcripts are sold of these hearings, we can take some of those lines verbatim and read them and share them and underline how many times these crybabies said, we just didn't get a finding, about the arms to Iran, and we wanted you to tell us. And when we call you in and tell us what you're doing, don't lie to us. The truth is that Poindexter and North didn't have to lie, or Meese or Schultz or Weinberg. They didn't have to lie to Congress because Congress gives them everything they want. They just don't want to be lied to because, and that was their big beef. They had to create that beef because, as I say, there were 3 instances that caused the whole thing to be opened up. So then they narrowed it down to that beef. And nobody has lied to them more than George Shultz or Elliot Abrams or Caspar Weinberger through the years. But they came out as the elderly statesmen. They didn't even have a notebook hardly to look at, a question to ask. These were patriots who had long years of service while all these other coups were going on and countries were overthrown and heads of states were killed and airplanes blown up. These were the people that were put on as being so great. Now, as far as the junta and Paul Sarbanes' concern about it, or Daniel Inouye is concerned about it, the junta took place a long time ago. They just haven't caught on. I've had it on my program for 16 years. And when I did my first article, I started talking about the junta. There were 3 times where the junta, or 4, when it really started. And until they go back to that, you will never understand how this country was given away and how the executive was tilted to the head of Fritz Kramer, that the Constitution and law have to wait and foreign policy comes first. The first beginning of the junta, as I say, took place in 1943 with William Stevenson, when he set up headquarters in Rockefeller Center and then went down to Montego Bay. And through the operations of an organization like Permindex, they could kill every head of state they wanted, including, in this country, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. The second part of the junta took place when Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS coordinated with Alan Dulles of the OSS to sit over in Bern, Switzerland, and make arrangements with the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, to Heinrich Himmler's organization, to coordinate with them to have a rat line to take the top Nazis out of Europe using the Vatican and the Red Cross, and hire other top Nazis to kill the resistance leaders in countries all over the world, in Asia and Europe, wherever they lived, and those opponents to fascism at the time of the war. One book, The Secret Surrender by Alan Dulles, came out in 1966, has to do with his meeting with the Waffen-SS and the deals that were made in Bern. Another book, Operation Sunrise, The Secret Surrender by Bradley Smith in 1979. And these books tell how the OSS worked with the Waffen-SS, and that's when they cut their deals. And the third part of the coup took place May 1943, 44 years ago, when Heinrich Himmler's organization, the goal of 1,000-year Reich, the SS Gestapo, made their arrangements for the entire preparatory work for Nazi underground after the war. This is described in the book The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Reese, who was at that meeting. One of the people was Hjalmar Schacht, the financier for the Deutsche Bank, that John J. McCloy from Chase Manhattan Bank released after a few years at the Nuremberg prison. John J. McCloy went on to be on the Warren Commission with Allen Dulles. Those two men supervised covering up the murder of the President of the United States. And the fourth part of our coup was described in one book. There's a lot of them. One I have, the Hoover Commission report by Herbert Hoover on the reorganization of the executive branch, Public Law 162, signed July the 7th, 1947. And that is when the executive branch went into the hands and the ears of the military and took the kilder off the Constitution, the checks and balances of the executive, legislation, and judicial, and tilted the executive to the CIA and the NSC. So it was 3 against 1 and 1, or 3 against 2, and it's never been balanced since. And while all the rhetoric of Senator Inouye was going on about all the evils in the White House, and he listed the things that happened in the National Security Council and the terrible things that Oliver North and Poindexter and Secord and Hakeem were doing, all these terrible things. Keep in mind, not only has the president been praising them and calling one a hero, and Inouye ran down this stuff that was destroyed, but Fawn Hall still works in the Defense Department. She hasn't been fired. Oliver North still works in the Defense Department under the Federal Emergency Management with the plans officers. Admiral Poindexter is now forced to retire. He's still in the Pentagon. General John Singlaub is still running around trying to overthrow Laos, the Philippines, the Asian islands, and Panama. And Albert Hakeem and Secord still have their $8 million profit that nobody can touch. So the farce, and it was a farce, like the Warren Commission, but out of the farce will come facts and truths for generations to come. But the work will be ours. It won't be their work. We'll pay for their multi-million-dollar investigation, but that's the first step. One of the people, I forget which one of the congressmen today, didn't approve of the hearings, and he said there's certain facts of life like diarrhea, and diarrhea comes out, and you shouldn't have it all in the public, even though it's a fact of life. I forgot to write down which one said it. I was so amazed to hear it. Well, the diarrhea is out, and the more it's out, the more it smells, and it will keep stinking if it isn't cleaned up. He's right. The diarrhea came out. Now it's up to us as private individuals to see what we can do. The San Francisco Chronicle, getting on to another subject but not separate, had an article this morning from Reuters. The Reagan aides probed over the Iran talks in 1980. That's the title. And this story was on CNN yesterday. It said the Iran-Contra special prosecutor and congressional investigators looked into the charges that aides to Ronald Reagan dealt with Iran before he was elected president in 1980 in an attempt to block the release of the hostages. And this will be in Newsweek this week. Newsweek quoted a staff member of the special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, saying that their investigation led them down a blind alley. Lawrence Walsh. Newsweek did an interview with Barbara Honegger, who lives here in Pacific Grove, and they waited, of course, until Lawrence Walsh says there's no evidence in this, and so it'll be a downer if they quote their interview with her at all. They've already thrown this out. They wouldn't dare take it to people called on the stand under oath, or they would go to jail for telling a lie or give immunity for these charges, and then we'd find out. They wait till the day the Iran-Contra hearings are over and then say this was a blind alley. The article said that Reagan representatives did meet with Iranians in 1980. They wanted to learn whether a surprise release was planned in October, and this involved Oliver North and General Secord in those days. And the meeting was a month before the elections in October. Presumably, such a release of hostages could have helped reelect Jimmy Carter, who was defeated by Ronald Reagan in the landslide. A White House spokesman dismissed the report, saying that's an old story. It was dealt with a long time ago. It was dealt with in the fact that whenever it was brought up, they denied it. That's the way they mean it was dealt with. Well, the John Kennedy assassination or Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy are old stories, and people involved say that's the same old story. But you can't get them under oath before a decent investigation to end that old story by trying to find out what happened. Now, I have many articles on Israel sending arms to Iran for a long time, and the belief is that Alexander Haig was agreeing with Israel that in return for their holding the hostages until after the election was over in 1980, Israel would send the weapons to Iran, their mortal enemy, as a favor for the United States, and keep them happy, as agreed the hostages would be out the day that Reagan took oath of office. The Wall Street Journal had an article November 28, 1986. Israel is said to have sold weapons to Iran since 1981 with the tacit approval of the Reagan administration. That's the great leftist newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. It said two sources said Mr. Haig was briefed on the Israeli sales to Iran in preparation for a February 20th, 1981 meeting with Israeli Foreign Minister Yatsi Shamir, who became Israel's prime minister. Mr. Haig decided not to raise the issue. Replenishing Israeli weapon stocks was brought up. This thing goes back to 1981, Wall Street Journal said. Much of the cabinet knew about it, and incidentally, the question came up today with Caspar Weinberger. Did you ever know that Israel was sending weapons to Iran before 1985? He says, not to my personal knowledge. This is under oath. No, not at all. I didn't know it. The Wall Street Journal wrote in 1986 that Schultz was involved in the weapons. Howard Baker knew. Weinberger knew. Haig knew about it before he left office. Another U.S. intelligence source contended it was implicit that any time the Israelis sent anything anywhere, they would be compensated, and if they sent their own stuff, it was understood we would replace it. Israel would never incur any cost or drawdowns of its own stock, even if we hadn't explicitly asked them to make the sales. This is the Wall Street Journal. Also, the Washington Post, November 27, 1986, Haig okayed shipment to Iran in 1981. Another long article, a quarter of a page, and another article out of the Kansas City Star, November 29, 1986, about Alexander Haig sending weapons. It said even before 1981, the sources said, Mr. McFarland proposed dramatic, covert initiatives involving Iran in 1980 while he was on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And if Reagan became president, he would be National Security Advisor. McFarland approached the Reagan campaign's foreign policy advisor, Richard Allen, with an Iranian exile who proposed to deliver the American hostages then held in Iran to the Reagan camp before the November election. The initiative, it says, went nowhere, sources added. Well, if the initiative went nowhere, it's very interesting that the airplane, the helicopter that went over to rescue the hostages, blew up and malfunctioned, that the hostages were released on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and the rescue mission was ruined, and the president had the briefing papers and all the papers of President Carter that he needed, and he was talking with Iranians about the rescue mission, and McFarland had access to from the Armed Services Committee to Iranians. The last sentence that went nowhere when all the evidence proved it went everywhere, and Richard Allen became National Security Advisor. McFarland then took his job. William Casey became director of the CIA. Everybody had a part in that, including General Secord, who was in charge of the rescue, which was a sabotage operation. Got $8 million that he can divide with Albert Hakim in his bank. And when they needed an operation mechanism for sending arms to Iran later, when they stopped the Israeli shipment, it was William Casey of the CIA who told Oliver North, use Secord. And Secord and Hakim put a lot of money in their bank. A long time ago, broadcast number 586, that's a long time ago, I referred to an article by Fred Landis. It was in Covert Action, April 1981, called The Right's Revenge, Spies and the Reagan Victory, the October 22nd movement by Fred Landis. And this is how the spies that were removed from the intelligence community when Stansfield Turner became director, were all put back as an organization and helped get Ronald Reagan become president by being behind the sabotage of the rescue mission, the October 80 surprise. This article is about the role of the CIA. Also in Rebel magazine, the same issue that I had my article in on the Nazis and the Kennedy assassination, on page 53 for 10 pages is a long article by Don Fried called A Question of Treason, how Ronald Reagan sabotaged the Iranian hostage rescue mission. The Iranians knew we were coming. There's a very interesting part of this article. The next to last paragraph of the article on page 59. Don Fried said there is a final strange piece in this puzzle of the Iranian hostage story. During the hostage crisis in 1980, the United States Army Intelligence set up a special unit in Iran, and this is very important. It was called the Intelligence Support Activity, ISA. It was so secret it operated virtually under an illegal status. It has since been disbanded, but in 1980, Stansfield Turner didn't even know of the existence of the ISA when he was CIA director, but Reagan campaign director William Casey did. Now, the ISA was not known to the CIA director, but it turns out that that operation is the one that Ollie North used, one of his 3 commando units. I wanted to go into that this evening, but I'll put it off till next week. The San Jose Mercury, July 27, 1987, has a diagram of 3 types of commando units that Oliver North operated. One was called the Intelligence Support Activity, the same one set up by William Casey in the Pentagon with no noticeable record by the CIA. These were Army commandos with complete sets of gears. The other commando group that North activated and controlled was the SEAL team. SEAL means Sea, Air, Land, Navy commandos. They had their own Rolls Royces and Mercedes-Benz. And the third group was the Task Force 160. And this involved the Joint Special Operations Command from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Oliver North was in charge of that. Now, he inherited a group called Task Force 157. Henry Kissinger was the head of that. George Bush was part of it. Admiral Bobby Inman and Edwin Wilson. And it involved the Nugan Bank. And all those people tied directly to Oliver North, General Secord, and the Choice Task Force 157 that I've done broadcasts on. The title was taken, the intelligence community believed, off a door for some reason, a number that had no special meaning. But what they did with Ollie North, they took a Task Force 160, they just moved up a couple of notches, 3 notches, and he was in charge of these operations. So what Don Fried thought in 1983 was so secret nobody knew about it, and that it was disbanded, wasn't disbanded, and Oliver North was in charge of the operations. And then Barbara Honegger wrote a long article, 2 full pages in these Times. I've mentioned it before. It was the June 24th issue several weeks ago, 1987, titled, Did Reagan Steal the 1980 Election? She was interviewed about that with Newsweek, and she thought it would come out last week, and it didn't. But now they can put her material, if they will cover it, and once the committee is over and they close their doors, the special prosecutor can say that's hogwash and negate the writing and research. Also, Christopher Hitchens in Nation wrote about the October 80 surprise, and Warren Hinkle in the San Francisco Examiner. The Wall Street Journal had a story today. Capitol Hill panel is faulted for failing to offer a full portrait of Israel's role in the Iran scandal. They can't get the full portrait of the Israeli role. They couldn't call any Israelis because they'd find out that Israel was sending arms from 1981 until 1985 for Ronald Reagan as payment and blackmail by Ayatollah Khomeini of the Iranians because they held the hostages. They hated Jimmy Carter for letting the Shah come into this country and tying up their money. And in return, we would send weapons for them because the Iraqi people were encouraged to make war against Iran. The intelligence community was told that Khomeini will fall within hours. The Shah's family will be back in power. And so Iraq was armed to the teeth by the Western countries, and the Shah died of cancer, and Khomeini's still in power. And he wanted to oblige in those days Ronald Reagan because he was so mad at Jimmy Carter bringing the Shah to this country. Now, going way back to December of 1986, we're talking about 7-8 months ago now, there was a long article in the Washington Times, that great radical right-wing paper titled "North Belonged to Secret Group That Planned Global Covert Action." They have North belonged as if it is past tense. There's nothing in North's history that means he's left the military, and if he's kicked out, he'll join John Singlaub and General Richard Secord and the retired, David Atlee Phillips and 600 or 700 of the retired that will continue offering their services to overthrow third world countries and to put in military dictatorships, and then they will reap the rewards of the multi-billion-dollar drug traffic. As Robert Owen said, let's get into Nicaragua. There's so much money, and Hakim and Secord were going to make so much money after they overthrew Iran and killed Khomeini. And they had weapons plants that they were going to start building their silencers. If North belonged to a secret group, he can still belong to it. There's no reason for past tense. And this article tells about the covert actions that this country's been in just between 1950 and 1974, such as the Philippines, Iran, Congo, Chile, Ecuador. I named some of those for you a little while ago. That was up till 1974. And then another article, November 16th, this was about the same time, a month before that came out, 1986. Reagan has okayed 50 covert operations. I have enough full-page articles to continue broadcast for the next 20 years if they didn't print anything new between now and the next 20 years, I believe. So much material has come out by very good writers. Alfonso Shardy from the San Jose Mercury News and Miami Herald had an article Reagan has going at the present time 50 covert operations that our government has signed their hands on, such as Ethiopia and Chad and so forth. And so they're not out of business. This sad story that you didn't give us a finding, these crybabies, or you didn't tell us what you did. They were only embarrassed, as I say, because they were forced to be exposed, blackmail from Iran, blackmail from Mr. Furmark, and from the Hassan Foss episode. There were some very good articles about Oliver North and the secret government, and I mean filling pages 10 by 14 when I scotch taped them to those pages. And one of particular interest was one I had on the air 4 weeks ago, program 813, called North and the Secret Government. This is about the martial law plan among Reagan's advisors. And I got a copy. I have the San Jose Mercury. It's by Alfonso Shardy. And I shared with you the October surprise that was in this article, the idea of an emergency czar, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I take the Miami Herald, but my edition of this July 5th didn't come to my home. And John Judge, the researcher from Washington who was on the West Coast, was talking to me about the meaning of this article. He picked up the Miami Herald. And when we read it side by side on the telephone, guess what was left out of the West Coast edition? The same issue, the same author, the same subject about the secret the secret martial law plot. One of the things that was kept out of this was, and I'll read you just this paragraph that was not printed on the West Coast. It talks about Oliver North in 1981 going to work for the National Security Council. At about this time, North completed his transfer in 1981 to the National Security Council from the Marine Corps. This article leaves out that he spent 1 year in the War College between the Marine Corps and the NSC. Those who worked with North in 1981 remember his first assignments as routine, but not unimportant. North was briefly assigned to carry the football, the briefcase containing the secret contingency plan for fighting a nuclear war, which was taken everywhere the president goes. North later widened his assignment to cover national crises contingency plan, which would be needed if we were going to drop the atomic bomb and press that football. In that capacity, he became involved in the controversial plan drafted as the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And another part of the Miami Herald News that was left out of the San Jose Mercury goes into the Federal Emergency Management Agency set up by Louis Giuffrida, who worked in California with Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese on the Garden Plot, the Garden Splicer, the plans for national emergency. And this article says, it says the martial law portions of the plan were outlined as early as June 30th, 1982, for Ronald Reagan in a memo by Guerfrida's deputy for national preparedness, John Brinkerhoff. A copy of the memo was obtained by the Miami Herald. The scenario outlined for Ronald Reagan in the Brinkerhoff memo was the same as the paper Guerfrida wrote in 1970 at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That's 1970 was when Nixon had been in office. Early part of his office, a couple of years prior to Watergate, Ronald Reagan was governor of California with Meese. What it had in the papers that were presented to the president in 1982, the same as 1970 when Reagan and Meese were in California, was the martial law plan included in case of a national uprising. The black people would be rounded up, the transfer to centers of relocation of camps of at least 21 million American Negroes. Now, on the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, I read again the King Alfred plan, the plan of the National Security Council to kill all blacks in America. The final solution will be vaporization of the blacks. And here we have Ronald Reagan with a plan made up by Mr. Guerfrida in the War College in 1970. Then he moved out to California in the National Guard with Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan in California, and with Helene von Damme as Reagan's secretary. Of course, working with Otto von Bolschwing from a country, he was from the Waffen SS. He sent his little secretary and translator to make all appointments for Reagan for 8 years. And he had some experience at Auschwitz with the exterminations there. In fact, he was one of the men behind taking all Jewish property, gold teeth, and relocating them back out into the ovens. So when Reagan was governor and when he hired Guerfrida in California and worked with the Guard and with Meese, the plans were drawn up then and they were brought to the White House in 1982 to relocate 21 million American Negroes. And part of this part, and I'll share more with you next week, has to do with what was kept out of the San Jose Mercury and what was in the Miami Herald. In these times, Alex Coburn has this past week, July 22nd, a reference to the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management, about North carrying this football, and he recalls that North had a problem of instability. He was in a mental hospital in Southeast Asia or after the Vietnam War, and even just before the Iran-Contra story fell apart, there were memos of Poindexter to McFarland, maybe we should send North back to Bethesda for a while. This is the guy who was holding the football and making the emergency plans up till the time of the Iran-Contra story, till November 25th, walking around with the football that starts the atomic wars. People's Daily World had an article titled Paper Reports New Concentration Camp Plans. This is a paper out of Baltimore, an article written by Hamil Harris in the Baltimore Afro-American, talking about the Alfonso Shardy story from the Miami Herald and his documents. And it goes on to remind people that when Reagan was governor from 1968 to 1972, a series of war games involved the state police, the National Guard, the U.S. Army, called Project Cable Slicer 1, 2, and 3, and the men in charge of it were Louis Guerfrida and Attorney General Edwin Meese, working in California at the time. And then this article goes on to say that at that time, Frank Carlucci, who's currently National Security Council Director, was Deputy Director in the Defense Department in 1970 when this was written, and it was applied again, updated in 1982. And what he said at that time as in the Defense Department was, quote, normally a state of martial law will be proclaimed by the president. That's normally. However, in the absence of such action by the president, if he's not around, if he's asleep, if he's gone where, who knows what, a senior military commander may impose martial law. And I just bring this up now. If you feel a little better or sleep a little better because the Iran-Contra has showed you this junta in the White House, what they showed you was what the congressman referred to as a lot of diarrhea that has to be cleaned up. And in come the mops and brooms, and we have to get this stink out of there. And there are vigilant writers coming out with excellent pieces of material. There will be good books coming out about this matter. And this concludes my opinions after the completion of the Iran-Contra affair, and I'll be talking about it for a long, long time.